those bottom performing on a net margin per hectare basis, they are paying more per hectare for land rental. But when you control for everything else, it's actually not statistically significant. There's differences in size, there's differences in system, there's differences in soil classification, management expertise of the farmer. So you have to not just look at one element of your costs, but the overall management. A land rental cost does have an impact, but there's also an awful lot else going on, a lot of differences across the system.
Every sports event, whether it's athletics, football or rugby, gives us a chance to see how our athletes compare to the rest of the world. Likewise, we're constantly hearing how Ireland compares in terms of costs, income or productivity across different sectors. Benchmarking is key. It helps you to see whether your performance is in the middle of the pack, above it or below it. The same principle applies to farming. If you don't measure it, it's very hard to improve it. You're listening to the latest episode of the Tillage Edge with me, Michael Hennessy. We'd really appreciate it if you could listen, follow and give us a review on Apple or Spotify or wherever you get your podcast from. Tillage farmers are good at keeping records of some kind, but relatively few take the next steps, bringing those figures all the way through to calculate accurate margins per field or per crop. Once you have that level of detail, the next step is to compare your figures with others to see how your performance stacks up. To explore this further, I'm joined today by Dr. Fiona Thorne, an economic researcher with Teagasc, and Ciaran Collins at Teagasc Tillage Specialist. We'll chat about the recently published Teagasc Cereal Factsheets for 2024 and how farmers can make best use of it. Fiona, to start off, you might tell us where the figures from the fact sheets come from and who the report is aimed at.
So the Cereal Enterprise Factsheet and the newly published online portal associated with that, showing the trends over time, is based on data from the Teagasc National Farm Survey. And I think it's really important to put that data into context and to compare and contrast it with the data which farmers around the country are used to looking at, which is the crop costs and returns, which I'm sure Ciaran will talk a little bit more later on. But the Teagasc National Farm Survey, we have recorders out in the field going to about 1,000 farms each year, and within that sample we then have a sample of cereal producers. And what the Cereal Enterprise Factsheet does is that it looks at two of our main cereal crops, looks at spring barley and looks at winter wheat. But just to explain the difference then in the types of data, the margin, net margin data and gross margin data that you're looking at in that Cereal Enterprise Factsheet, say compared to the crop costs and returns. So the crop costs and returns is a budgeting exercise, which is done at the start of the year, estimating what the actual costs and the returns will look like for the coming year. Whereas what the National Farm Survey does is that it's a survey looking at the costs, returns and performance as they actually happened during the year. So it's a budgeting exercise as opposed to actual data in survey format. So that's the main difference between the National Farm Survey and the crop costs and returns. But key in both of them is benchmarking. I think that'll be a good team to work with here for today, Michael, is benchmarking.
So basically, it's worthwhile maybe having a look at both of them, but there will be stark differences between both of them, and the National Farm Survey is essentially the real figures. And I suppose the thing, looking at Fiona, in terms of fixed costs, they seem to vary widely, between farms and cost and returns. We have, I suppose, an average figure across everybody of €204 per hectare. Yet the fact sheets, it's a much bigger figure. Say for spring barley, it's €695 per hectare. What's the difference in that?
So that €204, to be precise, that you're talking about, Michael, say there for the crop costs and returns for last year, that's data that actually comes from the Teagasc National Farm Survey. So on an annual basis, I work with Shay and I work with Ciaran to look at the full distribution of fixed costs within the National Farm Survey. But you need to remember, in the crop costs and returns, what we're looking at is direct costs of production, and assuming that a contractor comes in to do to do the ploughing, tilling, sowing and harvesting. Whereas what we're looking at in the National Farm Survey, some farmers will have contractors, whereas some of them will do it themselves. So that €204 overhead costs, fixed costs in the crop costs and returns just pertains to costs not associated with machinery and not associated with labour. So it's costs associated with building depreciation, car, phone, electricity, those type of costs. And of course, the big one is land rent. There's no land rent in that either. So you just need to be careful with that when you're looking at crop costs and returns, and when you're looking at the Cereal Enterprise Factsheet, is the differentiation of definitions of what you're looking at. But we've done as good a job as we can with trying to streamline that and stripping away those costs which are already accounted for in the crop costs and returns. Main difference being contracting and labour charges already accounted for.
And you mentioned land rental, which can be a fairly massive cost. And I suppose a big difference between the cost and returns and what you're showing in the fact sheets is land rental is included. So whether it's so say if a farmer has 100 hectares, but only 20 of that is rented, that goes across everything that you see there. Is that how it works?
Exactly, Michael. Yeah. So within those average figures that you have in the Cereal Enterprise Factsheet, that will be made up of a mix of some farmers that own all of their land and other farmers at the other extreme that rent all of their land. And somewhere in between, some of it is owned and some of it is rented. But just particularly on that land rental, what we do on an annual basis in the farm survey is strip away those farmers that don't rent land and just look at the amount of rented land that they have, and see how that is changing over time. I was looking at that recently for another exercise. So over the last couple of years, we have seen an increase in that land rental charge on a per hectare basis. It's looking at somewhere between €220, €250 per hectare over the last 3 years on average for those farmers that are renting land. But yeah, we're seeing an increase in that over time.
So farmers then in that scenario who are paying way more for land rental now in comparison to what they would have been in the past, but also might have a higher proportion of land rental in their system, they're likely to be low performing farms in terms of overall net margin. Would that be right?
Yeah, you'd think that, Michael, wouldn't you? Like we talk so much about land rental and the impact that's having on net margin. And that's actually another research project that we have starting just at the moment, looking at those drivers of performance over time. But looking at it, there's actually a lot of differences going on. And when we control for all of those differences and we just look at those top performing farms and those bottom performing farms, yes, you were right in saying that those bottom performing on a net margin per hectare basis, they are paying more per hectare for land rental. But in statistical terms, when you control for everything else, it's actually not statistically significant. So it just means that there's an awful lot going on. There's differences in size, there's differences in system, there's differences in soil classification, management of the farmer, management expertise of the farmer. So you have to not just look at one element of your costs, but the overall management and how that happens. So yeah, you are right. Land rental cost does have an impact, but there's also an awful lot else going on, a lot of differences across the system.
Okay. So, Ciaran, I just want to bring you in here for a second. And, in terms of the fact sheets there's a huge range in performance. The top spring barley farms had a margin of €600, while the bottom made a loss of €247 per hectare. That's a massive difference between the two of them. I suppose taking into consideration what Fiona said a minute ago, but are there other or maybe a few key management decisions that you think might separate some of these top guys from the guys who are really just not making any money at all, losing money, in fact?
Yeah, there's a lot going on there, as Fiona says, and like you could highlight a lot, but maybe to pick on two or three, like agronomy and timing of inputs, I think is a huge one. You could take a winter wheat grower that could be spending, say, €120 an acre on a fungicide program, two growers spending the same amount, and getting two different results just by, that precision timing, especially with the likes of Septori and that. So I think, timing and of those inputs is a big one, and especially as well with even practical stuff like sowing dates, sowing conditions, all areas around that, grower spending maybe the same money but getting totally different results. So I think that's a big one, really. I suppose on the cost side, like I think there's huge differences in efficiencies of machinery. That would be a big one for me, and we'll talk about machinery a little bit later on, but that machinery cost structure on farms I think is has a huge role there as well. And then I suppose maybe just to pick on one more, Michael, and there are lots, like I suppose the whole area around rotation and soil quality, I think is a big factor as well. And when we survey growers at the end of the year after the harvest, and you look at high yields versus low yields and that, and rotation has such an impact there, and the fertility of the soil, those two together, I think that's a big factor as well. So I suppose maybe that might help identify some of the key areas that I would see anyway, showing the differences.
Okay, and Fiona, in terms of we're talking a little bit about spring barley today, but you can equally do any of these comparisons to winter wheat as well. But say in the spring barley scenario, just to highlight, I suppose, some of the differences, there's a 30%, 38% differential in costs from the top group to the bottom group. In terms of those costs, where were the areas that there were the big differences in those?
Actually, when you look at that, Michael, it's fairly evenly split between those direct costs of production. And I'm talking about direct costs, I'm talking about fertiliser, seed and spray. And then that other category, I'm talking about overhead and machinery. That's the way I'm sort of lumping it together to try to make that direct comparison with the crop costs and returns. So looking at bottom performers versus top performers on a net margin per hectare for spring barley, there's about €150 per hectare of a difference in terms of overhead and machinery costs and those fertiliser, seeds and sprays between the bottom and the top performing. And I think that that's a stark finding, that if you think about the crop costs and returns, and we're using that as our go-to at the start of the year for our budgeting and benchmarking exercises, and we're using those as standard costs of production. But if you take fertiliser, seed and spray, between the bottom and the top performing farms, there's still €150 per hectare of a difference between farms out there in the actual population. So sitting down, knowing your own costs of production and knowing where those differences are coming from, it's vitally important. And that's a mix between using data such as this online portal that we have for the Enterprise Factsheet, and also using, say, pen and paper exercise from the COP costs and returns. So there's not one particular item that I'd say that I put my finger on and say, that's the gold standard. That's the one that you have to look at. It's across the whole system. It's direct costs, it's overhead costs, it's machinery, it's labour, Michael. Those differences are coming from a myriad of different sources.
So I suppose, just stepping back from it, there's either three things happening, maybe a combination of all three. They're either buying less of it, buying it for less money, or using it more efficiently. But either way, they're a good bit less anyway. Maybe something that's easier maybe to put your finger on, Fiona, is that, again, just going back to spring barley, just for one to compare different costs to, the top growers of spring barley had a 25% higher output in comparison to the bottom ones. What was that due to? Was it yield? Was it price? What was it?
It was both. So we have straw returns in there. We have price of the spring barley sold, and we have yield. But just looking at data from 2024, which is what we're looking at there, it was mostly coming from the price. So the top performers were actually getting a difference of over €50 a tonne for spring barley compared to the lower performing farms. Now, that's a huge difference. I think farmers often think about them being as price takers. They're going to the merchant, they're getting X price for their cereals, and it's the yield that they need to chase. But this data is actually showing us for the year 2024, there was on average a €50 difference difference in the price for that cereal that they were selling. And that's coming from a number of different sources. Again, it's coming from the fact that some farmers are forward selling and availing of forward selling. Some of them are getting loyalty bonuses from their merchants, and some of them are selling into niche markets. But yeah, if you were to look at yield and to look at price for the year just gone out, it's the big difference is on the price, and not the average yield that was attained.
Just wanted to struck me there now, Fiona, as you're chatting there. Is there a differential there? Spring barley can obviously be feed barley and malted barley, just two very different prices for both. Are
Yeah,
they
yeah.
equalised in there, or is that maybe that's what
Yeah,
accounts for
no,
some of the cost there?
no, no, not in this one. We've an extra crop code for malting barley, so it's not malting. That's differentiating us here in this one. And just on that, Michael, that new online portal, we're going to be updating it now in the course of the next couple of weeks, where you'll be able to look at the whole host of cereal, protein and oilseed crops that we're producing in the country, and look at that history over the last 10 years. So we won't just have the feed barley, spring barley that we're talking about here, but we'll also have the malting in there, and a whole host of other crops.
Kieran, those figures that Fiona are presenting there, that it takes a good bit of time and effort to actually get those, and they're relatively accurate from the point of view of being very precise towards the outcome of the various different crops. I suppose the advisory side of the house, or for farmers that are listening to this podcast, the profit monitor is the go-to tool for them, is it? In terms of trying to calculate something relatively similar to what Fiona is talking about here.
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose there's three ways you can look at the profitability on your farm. Firstly, you've got your tax accounts, your farm accounts, which are, I suppose, making sure that you're tax compliant, and it does give, I suppose, a historical record, of the financial setup on the farm. And then you have the crop costs and returns that Fiona spoke about, which is really, I suppose, it's like a budgeting tool, or it's kind of predicting the likely profit of a crop, and it's a good way of comparison. But the e-profit monitor, really, that is the only method that's available that looks at your costs. And I suppose there's a lot of benefits to the e-profit monitor. Firstly, they're your own costs. If you do it over time, you're starting to see the trend, and then it gives you good crop comparisons on your own farm. Whereas, I suppose the cost and returns start to take everything, in the same way. Whereas, the profit monitor will factor in, your land type, your management, and all of those factors as well. So you can see it over time. And I suppose the big one really is it does allow you to kind of benchmark against your peers. And I think a discussion group is a great example, because if you get a group of farmers in the same area, it's a great way then of benchmarking, and you can see both the physical and financial performance on your farm. And then you can see the areas maybe where you're out of kilter with everyone else, or maybe you're doing a little bit better. And then it's a management tool then to help you to improve on the areas that maybe you're spending too much, or maybe your output is too low or something.
A criticism, Kieran, that's often leveled at the profit monitor is, if I'm a farmer, why should I give Teagasc these things? Because they'll all be rolled in together, and that's what's going to set the price in the future. Is there any validity in that at all?
I don't know really. I mean, look, at the end of the day, it's a management tool. You don't have to publicly share your data or anything like that. As between yourself and your advisor. But I couldn't overemphasize its value as a management tool, and profit, and helping to increase profitability on the farm. And I suppose the other one, like we often say, 23 was a bad year, maybe 22 was a good year, but like the profit monitor helps you to kind of distinguish as well between, say, the market volatility in prices or weather events, and that as well, because you can pull that apart in the profit monitor. So I think its benefits are very, very strong, really.
Machinery costs, Kieran, are fairly substantial, as Fiona was outlining there earlier. On every farm, it's probably 25 or maybe 30% of total costs. Is there any good tool that a farmer can use to calculate their own machinery costs on their farm?
We have a machinery cost planner in Teagasc, and of all the tools we have, and I would be the first to admit, the profit monitor It takes time, and dedication to sit down and pull out the figures. But the machinery cost program that we have is very, very easy to use. A 1 hour consultation with your advisor, and you can very quickly work out your machinery costs at a point in time. I suppose that's an important thing, that when you go through and you get your result, that's where you are for 25. You need to do it over a few years to spot the trends, because, you'll have machines coming on and off finance and stuff like that. But that machinery cost control program is very easy to use. You need to know the values of your machine. You need to know what they would have cost you initially, which most people, can remember without too much research. And then maybe, costs then, like, your what you're paying in terms of finance and stuff like that. But it's a really, really good tool. I'd recommend anyone to use it. 1 phone call to your advisor, an hour consultation, and you'll have your machinery costs for 25.
Fiona, the Tillage 2027 roadmap set out some targets, financial targets for the various different sectors or various different crops, spring barley at €150 a hectare and winter wheat for €450 a hectare. How do the margins from the National Farm Survey, the people filling those in, how do they compare with those targets?
Okay, so that's a key performance indicator that we track on an annual basis, Michael. I think every sector needs key performance indicators, and those roadmap targets are very important for us to be able to track and see what the economic viability and what the technical performance is over time. But the one that is a key take home for me is that one which relates to net margin per hectare, and we have specific ones for spring barley, winter wheat and winter barley. So just looking at 2024, our most recent data, we found that 50% and 55% of spring barley and winter wheat farmers were achieving those targets that we set out. And I just want to relate that back to a point that Ciaran said there earlier on about the importance of using tools like the Profit Monitor, not just for 1 year, but over time. And if we look at that key performance indicator of net margin per hectare for those two crops, for spring barley and for winter wheat over those 3 years, we were somewhere in between with that 50-55% in 2024. Then go back 2023, we know that the achieving of those targets was low, very low, because of the year that we had. And then for 22, the percentage achievement was much higher. So just emphasising not just to look at it in terms of 1 year, but to look at it a trend over time. And I often use a 3-year rolling average to look at that type of indicator. But for the most recent year, about 50-55%, so 1 in 2 farmers for spring barley and winter wheat reaching those targets that we've set ourselves.
Fiona, very final question to you, and it's one you mentioned earlier before about this online portal. What can people do in it, and where can people find it?
So if you go on to the Teagasc website and look for Enterprise Factsheets, do a search for Enterprise Factsheets, you'll very easily come across it. It doesn't just do cereal enterprises, by the way. It does our dry stock and our dairy sectors as well. So you're able to compare and contrast the margins on a per hectare basis across the different systems. So what it does is that it looks over the last 10 years what the average returns were for our main cereal crops, looks at the distribution of costs and returns, yield performance, and some of these key performance indicators that, Michael, you and I are just after talking about there. So I think it's a very useful tool. It's not just one snapshot in time, but it's given you that trend over the last decade, how those indicators have tracked. And it's a key resource highlighting the output from our National Farm Survey. So I'd urge all our listeners there to go on and have a look at it. And I think one of the key take-homes from it, the key uses for it over time, could be if you marry that up with inputting data into something like the Profit Monitor, which Ciaran has talked about. So you're able to benchmark your own performance against the industry averages that we have there in that online Power BI portal.
So look, we're very much encouraging everybody to benchmark, to contact your local advisor, and start off with the machinery program. I suppose is the first place to start, and develop it on to get a profit monitor completed and start comparing to all the bits and pieces here that we'll be talking about today. Fiona and Ciaran, thanks very much again.
Thanks, Michael.
Thanks, Michael.
So that's it for today, and my thanks to Fiona and Ciaran for joining me on the podcast. So as always, if you enjoyed the podcast, then recommend it to a friend or colleague. And as always, rate, review on Apple or Spotify so you never miss an episode. And for more information, go to teagasc.ie. I'm Michael Hennessy, thanks for listening, and I'll be back next week with more tillage news and advice.